and start, if that's all right. I'm Colin McCabe, chairman of the London Consortium. When Mohsin Mustafi, the director of the Architectural Association, first suggested this conference, I reflected on the fact that much of my energies over the past 15 years have been devoted to celebrating London as a multicultural city. And I wondered why this had been such an important force in my life. And in this process of self-analysis, I came across a memory that I suspect is what Freud calls a screen memory, because its force and vividness in my mind does not seem necessarily to be explained by its content. Anyway, imagine, if you will, a small boy of 4 or 5 living with his younger brother and his Irish parents in the suburban delights of West Acton. And may I say, in contrast with what Hanif said at the NFT on Thursday night, that in my youth it was the suburbs which were the places of excitement and possibility. In Richmond with the Rolling Stones and the Yardbirds, in Shepherd's Bush with the Who. If one ventured up west to the Marquee, it was to find an island of the suburbs in a city otherwise given over to old rich people who wouldn't let you into their clubs, where in any case you'd certainly die of boredom. The swinging 60s and the King's Road were, from my perspective, a suburban invention. But all that was far in the future in 1953 or 54, when some Irish cousins came to visit us. In the course of planning their stay, which would of course include a visit to Trafalgar Square, close to the pub where my father had his offices, and where there was a huge column on the top of which there was a statue of the Russian leader Stalin, who had just died. I'm sorry if this detail is getting wearisome, but all such stories as the one I'm going to tell need, as they say, a full context. Anyway, as we got to the end of the pleasures of the capital, and I must tell you that in 1953 or 4 they were pretty thin on the ground, my cousins asked that we must be sure to include a large number of bus journeys in our plans, because they had never seen a black man, and they had heard that many of them were now conductors on London's buses, and they wanted to see one. The fact that my cousins had never seen a black man was to me an utterly amazing fact. But it did explain one thing to me. I knew that I lived in London, and I knew that London was one of the biggest and most famous cities in the world. And I now realize that one of the reasons that people came to visit it was because it had lots of black people in it. Thus, my politically correct multiculturalism and my politically incorrect metrocentrism were born in the same psychic moment. But the consortium's reasons for welcoming the Architectural Association's suggestion for this conference were much more than personal inclination. When we were casting about for a name at the beginning of this venture, we found the substantive very difficult to identify. Our founding institutions had already used up college, institute, school and gallery, and it took us a long time to find consortium, which finally convinced, because the image it summoned up of a shady cartel of dealers in tin metal futures was one that appealed to that narcissism prevalent in academics, where they like to imagine themselves as men of the world. But the qualifier had been there from the beginning. Whatever we were going to be London. And from the beginning, it has been our desire that London should be there both as audience and topic at the centre of the consortium's work. Like Milton in Areopagitica, we cannot praise a cloistered virtue. Our aim has been to allow our students to learn and develop knowledges, breathing in the very air of the capital. The conference with the AA and the associated photographic competition and exhibition are intended to signal a new phase in this commitment. It's perhaps inevitable that the most important figure in the conception and organisation of this conference has been Mark Cousins, whose dual role in both the AA and the consortium makes him peculiarly well placed to move from the most detailed realities of practice to the most arcane references of theory. Anyone who's been taught by Mark, who has heard him lecture, or indeed has simply stood next to him in the AA bar for half an hour, will know that this is someone of the keenest intelligence, of the most profound learning, and of the sharpest wit. By early training a historian, he then studied under Gombrich at the Courtauld, before the 70s laid their lugubrious hand on him and he turned into a sociologist. It would be difficult to encompass the range of his intelligence. I simply invite you to enjoy it when he will speak on the photographic exhibition and associated competition. Before that, we must, however, welcome Salman Rushdie, whose great novel, The Satanic Verses, has been the set text of the opening seminar of the consortium each year since its inception. All our students would testify to how rich and complex this novel is, how suited it is to demonstrate the multiplicities of knowledge in which we now live. One of the reasons we study this novel is that it is one and the same time, but that is at one level a profound meditation on the relation between television and film. And indeed all of Salman's writing testify to the centrality of film for his literary imagination. When John Woodward sacked me from the BFI last summer and withdrew from the consortium, he gave no reason, private or public. But he did say in a full staff meeting that he had been shocked and appalled to find students at the Institute studying the Satanic Verses. Leaving aside the explanation that he is a secret Muslim fundamentalist, one is driven ineluctably to the conclusion that he probably not only hadn't read the book, but that he also failed to read the course description, or indeed the posters decorating the BFI, which announced from BFI Publishing that Salman, in a quote, says that The Wizard of Oz was his first literary influence. But let's leave aside the ignorance of others. The consortium is devoted to this mixing of media and forms, of disciplines and topics, while we insist on the greatest rigor in the development of concepts and the collection of evidence. We insist also on the greatest promiscuity of topic and address. The Satanic Verses could in its entirety be the motto of the consortium, although its 600 pages makes it a rather long one. But we have asked Salman here today not simply for his importance to our work over the last 5 years, but because the Satanic Verses is, amongst other things, a great novel about London. The long central section, The City Visible but Unseen, takes us on an extraordinary tour of the literary representations of London past and the cultural realities of London present. It is a relatively unseen part of what might be called a too much seen text, and we thought that this conference would give us a chance to think about and discuss the Satanic Verses as a novel of post-colonial London. Salman, thank you.
Well, it's true that it's more or less exactly what I think about the Satanic Verses, that it was a novel about people coming to London. And this other Satanic Verses that gets referred to on the front pages of the newspapers seems to me like a book I don't fully understand. And so it's nice to be able to talk about those parts of the novel which are in fact most of the novel, as opposed to the 2 or 3 chapters that in the public mind represent the whole of the book. I thought I'd just read 2 or 3 passages from here and there, not necessarily in sequence, and just see how we go. I don't know how. I mean, we're running a bit late, so I don't know how much time we have.
I think
yeah. All right. Okay. Right. I have to change my glasses. I thought the first bit I'd read is about, let's say, a secondary character in the novel. The novel, for those of you who don't know it, is about the adventures of 2 actors, Jibril Farishta, Bombay movie star, and Saladin Chamcha, who is a British-based Asian who seems to make most of his money as a voice artist in television commercials. As he says, his face was the wrong color for their color TVs. But his voice is fine. The novel begins when they fall out of an airplane over Pevensey Bay and survive. I mean, I had thought that this might indicate to readers of the novel that it was an imaginative work. But I guess it didn't. Jibril has fallen in love with a Jewish English mountain climber, a woman called Ali, short for Alleluia, Cohn, and this is a passage about her family, really, her and her family. Her father being a Jewish immigrant into this country as a result of the events of the middle of the century. As I say, she's climbed Mount Everest, so it begins with her memories of that. And Alleluia Cohn, coming down from Everest, saw a city of ice to the west of Camp 6 across the rock band, glittering in the sunlight below the massif of Cho Oyu. Shangri-La, she momentarily thought. However, this was no green veil of immortality, but a metropolis of gigantic ice needles, thin, sharp, and cold. Her attention was distracted by Sherpa Pemba warning her to maintain her concentration, and the city had gone when she looked back. She was still at 27,000 feet, but the apparition of the impossible city threw her back across space and time to the Bayswater study of old dark wooden furniture and heavy velvet curtains in which her father, Otto Cohn, the art historian and biographer of Picabia, had spoken to her in her 14th and his final year of the most dangerous of all the lies we are fed in our lives, which was, in his opinion, the idea of the continuum. Anybody ever tries to tell you how this most beautiful and most evil of planets is somehow homogeneous, composed only of reconcilable elements, that it all adds up, you get on the phone to the straitjacket tailor, he advised her, managing to give the impression of having visited more planets than one before coming to his conclusions. The world is incompatible, just never forget it. Gaga. Ghosts, Nazis, saints, all alive at the same time, in one spot blissful happiness, while down the road the inferno. You can't ask for a wilder place. Ice cities on the roof of the world wouldn't have fazed Otto. Like his wife, Alicia, Ali's mother, he was a Polish émigré, a survivor of a wartime prison camp whose name was never mentioned throughout Ali's childhood. He wanted to make it as if it had not been, Alicia told her daughter later. He was unrealistic in many ways, but a good man, the best I knew. She smiled an inward smile as she spoke, tolerating him in memory, as she had not always managed to do during his life, when he was frequently appalling. For example, he developed a hatred of communism which drove him to embarrassing extremes of behavior, notably at Christmas, when this Jewish man insisted on celebrating with his Jewish family and others what he described as an English rite, as a mark of respect to their new host nation, and then spoiled it all in his wife's eyes by bursting into the salon where the assembled company was relaxing in the glow of log fire, Christmas tree lights and brandy, got up in pantomime Chinese, with droopy moustaches and all, crying, "Father Christmas is dead. I have killed him. I am the Mao. No presents for anyone." He. Ali on Everest, remembering, winced. Her mother's wince, she realized, transferred to her frosted face. Otto had called her his pearl without price and dreamed for her a great future as maybe a concert pianist or failing that a muse. "Your sister, frankly, is a disappointment to me," he said 3 weeks before his death in that study of great books and Picabian bric-a-brac, a stuffed monkey which he claimed was a first draft of the notorious portrait of Cézanne, portrait of Rembrandt, portrait of Renoir. Numerous mechanical contraptions, including sexual stimulators that delivered small electric shocks, and a first edition of Jarry's Ubu Roi. Elena wants where she should have thoughts, has wants where she should have thoughts. He anglicized the sister's name, Yelena, into Elena, just as it had been his idea to reduce Alleluia to Ali and Baudelarize himself, Cohen from Warsaw, into Cohn. Echoes of the past distressed him. He read no Polish literature, turning his back on Herbert, on Miłosz, on the younger fellows like Baranchak, because for him the language was irredeemably polluted by history. "I am English now," he would say proudly in his thick East European accent. "Silly Midoff, pish-tush, widow of Windsor, bugger all." In spite of his reticence, he seemed content enough being a pantomime member of the English gentry. In retrospect, though, it looked likely that he'd been only too aware of the fragility of the performance, keeping the heavy drapes almost permanently drawn in case the inconsistency of things caused him to see monsters out there, or moonscapes instead of the familiar Moscow road. He was strictly a melting pot man, Alicia said, while attacking a large helping of tsimis. When he changed our name, I told him, Otto, it isn't required. This isn't America, it's London W2. But he wanted to wipe the slate clean, even his Jewishness, excuse me, but I know. The fights with the Board of Deputies, all very civilized, parliamentary language throughout, but bare-knuckle stuff nonetheless. After his death, she went straight back to Cohen, the synagogue, Hanukkah, and Bloom's. No more imitation of life, she munched and waved the sudden, distracted fork. That picture, imitation of life, I was crazy for it. Lana Turner, am I right? And Mahalia Jackson singing in a church. Otto Cohen, as a man of 70 plus, jumped into an empty lift shaft and died. Now there was a subject which Alicia, who would readily discuss most taboo matters, refused to touch upon. Why does a survivor of the camps live 40 years and then complete the job the monsters didn't get done? Does great evil eventually triumph, no matter how strenuously it is resisted? Does it leave a sliver of ice in the blood, working its way through until it hits the heart? Or worse, can a man's death be incompatible with his life? Ali, whose first response on learning of her father's death had been fury, flung such questions at these as at her mother, who stone-faced beneath a wide black hat said only, "You have inherited his lack of restraint, my dear." After Otto's death, Alicia ditched the elegant high style of dress and gesture which had been her offering on the altar of his lust for integration, her attempt to be his Cecil Beaton grande dame. "Phew," she confided in Ali, "what a relief, my dear, to be shapeless for a change." She now wore her grey hair in a straggly bun, put on a succession of identical floral print supermarket dresses, abandoned makeup, got herself a painful set of false teeth, planted vegetables in what Otto had insisted should be an English floral garden, neat flower beds around the central symbolic tree, a chimeran graft of laburnum and broom, and gave, instead of dinners full of cerebral chat, a series of lunches, heavy stews and a minimum of 3 outrageous puddings, at which dissident Hungarian poets told convoluted jokes to Gurdjieffian mystics. Or if things didn't quite work out, the guests sat on cushions on the floor staring gloomily at their loaded plates, with something very like total silence reigned for what felt like weeks. Ali eventually turned away from these Sunday afternoon rituals, sulking in her room until she was old enough to move out with Alicia's ready assent, and from the path chosen for her by her father, whose betrayal of his own act of survival had angered her so much. She turned towards action and found she had mountains to climb. Well, that's Otto. Jibril Farishta has a different view of London, affected by the fact that he's mad, and believes himself to be the reincarnation of the angel Gabriel, and therefore able to do things which angels can do. In this particular passage, he's wandering in London, deranged, believing himself to be the angel, and having plans for the city. He was hovering high over London. Ha ha, they couldn't touch him now, the devils rushing upon him in that pandemonium. He looked down upon the city and saw the English. The trouble with the English was that they were English. Damn cold fish. Living underwater most of the year, in days the color of night. Well, he was here now, the great transformer, and this time there'd be some changes made. The laws of nature are the laws of its transformation, and he was the very person to utilize the same. Yes, indeed, this time, clarity. He would show them, yes, his power. These powerless English. Did they not think their history would return to haunt them? The native is an oppressed person whose permanent dream is to become the persecutor. Fanon. English women no longer bound him. The conspiracy stood exposed. Then away with all fogs, he would make this land anew. He was the archangel Jibril. He had come to transform. Abracadabra. Hocus pocus. But where should he begin? Well then, the trouble with the English was their, in a word, Jibril solemnly pronounced, their weather. Jibril Farishta, floating on his cloud, formed the opinion that the moral fuzziness of the English was meteorologically induced. When the day is not warmer than the night, he reasoned, when the light is not brighter than the dark, when the land is not drier than the sea, then clearly a people will lose the power to make distinctions. And commence to see everything, from political parties to sexual partners to religious beliefs, as much the same. Nothing to choose, give or take. What folly! For the truth is extreme. It is so and not thus. It is him and not her. A partisan matter, not a spectator sport. It is, in brief, heated. City, he cried, and his voice rolled over the metropolis like thunder, I am going to tropicalize you. Jibril enumerated the benefits of the proposed metamorphosis of London into a tropical city. Increased moral definition, institution of a national siesta, development of vivid and expansive patterns of behavior among the populace, higher quality popular music, new birds in the trees, macaws, peacocks, cockatoos, new trees under the birds, cocoa palms, tamarind, banyans with hanging beards, improved street life, outrageously colored flowers, magenta, vermilion, neon green, spider monkeys in the oak trees, a new mass market for domestic air conditioning units, ceiling fans, anti-mosquito coils and sprays, a coir and copra industry, increased appeal of London as a centre for conferences, etc., better cricketers, higher emphasis on ball control among professional footballers, the traditional and soulless English commitment to high work rate having been rendered obsolete by the heat, religious fervour, political ferment, renewal of interest in the intelligentsia, no more British reserve, hot water bottles to be banished forever, replaced in the fetid nights by the making of slow and odorous love. Emergence of new social values. Friends to commence dropping in on one another without making appointments. Closure of old folks' homes. Emphasis on the extended family. Spicier food. The use of water as well as paper in English toilets. The joy of running fully dressed through the first rains of the monsoon. Disadvantages. Cholera. Typhoid, Legionnaire's disease, cockroaches, dust, noise, a culture of excess. Standing upon the horizon, spreading his arms to fill the sky, Jibril cried, let it be. Well. And I must say, since the book was written, it sort of happened too, didn't it? So there we are. Saladin Chamcha has a rather different view of London. More, well, I'll let him say it rather than me, but really perhaps the exact polar opposite of Jibril's view, so I thought I'd read a few pages of that. There has been a sort of strange event in the novel where Chamcha has metamorphosed into something looking rather like the devil and then back again. This is slightly after he comes back to his ordinary shape, but I mean, that doesn't actually happen in the passage. He's back home here. It all boiled down to love, reflected Saladin Chamcha in his den. Love, the refractory bird of Mayak and Halevi's libretto for Carmen. One of the prized specimens, this, in the allegorical aviary he'd assembled in lighter days, and which included amongst its winged metaphors the sweet bird of youth, the yellow bird, more lucky than me, Khayyam Fitzgerald's adjectiveless bird of time, which has but a little way to fly and lo is on the wing, and the obscene bird, this last from a letter written by Henry James, Sr., to his sons. Every man who has reached his intellectual teens begins to suspect that life is no farce, that it is not genteel comedy even, that it flowers and fructifies, on the contrary, out of the profoundest tragic depths of the essential dearth in which its subject's roots are plunged. The natural inheritance of everyone who is capable of spiritual life is an unsubdued forest where the wolf howls and the obscene bird of night chatters. Take that, kids. And in a separate but proximate glass display case of the younger, happier Chumcha's fancy, there fluttered a captive from a piece of hit parade bubblegum music, the bright, elusive butterfly, which shared l'amour with the oiseau rebelle. Love, a zone in which nobody desirous of compiling a human as opposed to robotic, Skinnerian, android body of experience could afford to shut down operations, did you down, no question about it, and very probably did you in as well. It even warned you in advance. Love is an infant of Bohemia, sings Carmen, herself the very idea of the beloved, its perfect pattern, eternal and divine. And if you love me, look out for you. You couldn't ask for fairer. For his own part, Saladin had in his time had loved widely, and was now, he had come to believe, suffering love's revenges upon the foolish lover. Of the things of the mind, he had loved most the protean, inexhaustible culture of the English-speaking peoples. Had said when courting Pamela, it's his wife, that Othello, just that one play, was worth the total output of any other dramatist in any other language. And though he was conscious of hyperbole, he didn't think the exaggeration very great. Pamela, of course, made incessant efforts to betray her class and race, and so predictably professed herself horrified, bracketing Othello with Shylock and beating the racist Shakespeare over the head with the brace of them. He had been striving, like the Bengali writer Niraj Chaudhry before him, though without any of that impish colonial intelligence's urge to be seen as an enfant terrible, to be worthy of the challenge represented by the phrase civis Britannicus sum. Empire was no more, but still he knew all that was good and living within him to have been made, shaped, and quickened by his encounter with this islet of sensibility, surrounded by the cool sense of the sea. Of material things he had given his love to this city, London, preferring it to the city of his birth, or to any other, had been creeping up on it stealthily with mounting excitement, freezing into a statue when it looked in his direction, dreaming of being the one to possess it, and so, in a sense, become it. As when in the game of grandmother's footsteps, the child who touches the one who's it takes over that cherished identity, as also in the myth of the Golden Bough. London, its conglomerate nature mirroring his own, its reticence also his, its gargoyles, the ghostly footfalls in its streets of Roman feet, the honks of its departing migrant geese. Its hospitality, yes, in spite of immigration laws and his own recent experience, he still insisted on the truth of that. An imperfect welcome, true, one capable of bigotry, but a real thing nonetheless, as was attested by the existence in a South London borough of a pub in which no language but Ukrainian could be heard, and by the annual reunion in Wembley, a stone's throw from the great stadium surrounded by imperial echoes, Empire Way, the Empire Pool, of more than 100 delegates all tracing their ancestry back to a single small Goan village. We Londoners can be proud of our hospitality, he told Pamela, and she, giggling helplessly, took him to see the Buster Keaton movie of that name, Our Hospitality, in which the comedian arriving at the end of an absurd railway line gets a murderous reception. In those days they had enjoyed such oppositions, and after hot disputes had ended up in bed. He returned his wandering thoughts to the subject of the metropolis. Its, he repeated stubbornly to himself, long history as a refuge, a role it maintained in spite of the recalcitrant ingratitude of the refugees' children, and without any of the self-congratulatory, huddled masses rhetoric of the nation of immigrants across the ocean, itself far from perfectly open-armed. Would the United States, with its are you now, have you ever beens, have permitted Ho Chi Minh to cook in its hotel kitchens? What would its McCarran-Walter Act have to say about a latter-day Karl Marx standing bushy-bearded at its gates, waiting to cross its yellow lines? Oh, proper London! Dull would he truly be of soul who did not prefer its faded splendors, its new hesitancies, to the hot certainties of that transatlantic New Rome with its Nazified architectural gigantism, which employed the oppressions of size to make its human occupants feel like worms. London, in spite of an increase in excrescences such as the NatWest Tower, a corporate logo extruded into the third dimension, preserved the human scale. Viva Zindabad. Pamela had always taken a caustic view of such rhapsodies. These are museum values, she used to tell him, sanctified, hanging in golden frames on honorific walls. She had never had any time for what endured. Change everything. Rip it up. He said, if you succeed, you will make it impossible for anybody like you in 1 or 2 generations to come along. She celebrated this vision of her own obsolescence. If she ended up like the dodo, a stuffed relic, class straighter 1980s, that would, she said, certainly suggest an improvement in the world. He begged to differ, but by this time they had begun to embrace, which surely was an improvement, so he conceded the other point. One year, the government had introduced admission charges at museums, and groups of angry art lovers picketed the temples of culture. When he saw this, Chamcha had wanted to get up a placard of his own and stage a one-man counter-protest. Didn't these people know what the stuff inside was worth? There they were, cheerfully rotting their lungs with cigarettes worth more per packet than the charges they were protesting against. What they were demonstrating to the world was the low value they placed on their cultural heritage. Pamela put her foot down. Don't you dare, she said. She held the then correct view that the museums were too valuable to charge for. So, don't you dare, and to his surprise he found he did not. He had not meant what he would have seemed to mean. He had meant that he would have given, maybe in the right circumstances, his life for what was in those museums. So he could not take seriously these objections to a charge of a few pence. He quite saw, however, that this was an obscure and ill-defended position. And of human beings, Pamela, I loved you. Culture, city, wife, and the fourth and final love of which he had spoken to nobody, the love of a dream. In the old days, the dream had recurred about once a month. A simple dream set in a city park along an avenue of mature elms whose overarching branches turned the avenue into a green tunnel into which the sky and the sunlight were dripping here and there through the perfect imperfections in the canopy of leaves. In this sylvan secrecy, Saladin saw himself accompanied by a small boy of about 5 whom he was teaching to ride a bicycle. The boy, wobbling alarmingly at first, made heroic efforts to gain and maintain his balance, with the ferocity of one who wishes his father to be proud of him. The dream Chamcha ran along behind his imagined son, holding the bike upright by gripping the parcel rack over the rear wheel. Then he released it, and the boy, not knowing himself to be unsupported, kept going. Balance came like a gift of flight, and the two of them were gliding down the avenue, Chamcha running, the boy pedaling harder and harder. You did it, Saladin rejoiced, and the equally elated child shouted back, look at me, see how quickly I learned, aren't you pleased with me, aren't you pleased? It was a dream to weep at, for when he awoke, there was no bicycle and no child. I think one more little bit in tribute to the special branch who I didn't know at this time. Therefore, the view of them is different. This is about a scene about the demonstrations of the anti-Vietnam War demonstration. So it's an anti-Harold Wilson demonstration taking place in rainy conditions. That day it rained an ocean. The other character I should introduce here is Chamcha is here, much younger, as a student with his friend Jumpy, who later becomes his wife's lover, but that's another story. Here they're both 19 or 20, I guess. That day it rained an ocean. The demonstrators in the square were soaked through. Jumpy and Chamcha, swept along by the crowd, found themselves pushed up against the steps of the town hall. Grandstand view, Chamcha said with heavy irony. Next to them stood 2 students disguised as Russian assassins, in black fedoras, greatcoats and dark glasses, carrying shoeboxes filled with ink-dipped tomatoes and labelled in large block letters, bombs. I have to tell you, this is entirely naturalistic, this, and it refers to a more innocent age. Shortly before the Prime Minister's arrival, one of them tapped a policeman on the shoulder and said, "Excuse, please. When Mr. Wilson, self-styled Prime Minister, comes in long car, kindly request him to wind down windows so my friend can throw with him the bombs." The policeman answered, "Ho, ho, sir." "Very good, sir. Now, I'll tell you what. You can throw eggs at him, sir, because that's all right with me. And you can throw tomatoes at him, sir, like what you've got there in that box, painted black labelled bombs, because that's all right with me. You throw anything hard at him, sir, my mate here will get you with his gun." Oh, days of innocence when the world was young. When the car arrived, there was a surge in the crowd, and Chumcha and Jumpy were separated. Then Jumpy appeared, climbing onto the bonnet of Harold Wilson's limousine, and began to jump up and down on the bonnet, creating large dents, leaping like a wild man to the rhythm of the crowds chanting, "We shall fight, we shall win, long live Ho Chi Minh." Saladin started yelling at me to get off, partly because the crowd was full of special branch types converging on the limo, but mainly because he was so damn embarrassed. But he kept leaping, up higher, down harder, drenched to the bone, long hair flying, Jumpy the jumper leaping into the mythology of those antique years. And Wilson and Marcia cowered in the back seat, ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh. At the last possible moment, Jumpy took a deep breath and dived headfirst into a sea of wet and friendly faces and vanished. They never caught him. Saladin wouldn't speak to me for over a week, Jumpy remembered, and when he did, all he said was, "I hope you realize those cops could have shot you to pieces." But they didn't. Right, stop there. Let's stand up.
Okay, well, we now ask for a question-and-answer session. I know that the London Consortium students are primed and ready, so the rest of you may have a few moments to gather your questions. Okay, questions?
Thank you for your talk. In Satanic Verses, London is described as the local classicalism of reality. The cities presented at different scales and registers. Cities presented at different scales and registers, from stage set to A to Z map to tropical paradise. I'm wondering, have these models of London changed or multiplied since writing the book?
Yeah, well, I think I wouldn't do it that way now, because I think the city now is very unlike the London of the period of high Thatcherism, which is what the book's written about. Better in some ways, worse in others. And I think certainly that idea, the city visible but unseen, which very much seemed to me to be a description of non-white, if you like, London in the early and middle 80s, I think isn't true anymore. And I think that to that extent the city's become visible, or that city that I've tried to write about, or much more visible than it used to be. And that's good. And I think, if you like, the separation of communities is much less than it used to be. And that's good. Much better, for example, in London than in New York, where really people, white people don't know any black people. Or if they do, they rather prize the two black people they know. So yeah, I'd write about it differently now. And I think clearly, given Stephen Lawrence and all that, I mean, the problem isn't gone away. But it's a different sort of reality now, I think. Yes.
Yeah. I was thinking that I wonder if you could say a couple of words about post-colonialism in the register of art, and I'm thinking about that in the following terms, that in a sense, both the photographic exhibition yesterday and the passages that you just read, these kind of 4 or 5 characters, seem to me to raise that question, because if art is, if we were to say for a moment that art is, or that what's perhaps more important than the content of an art is the relationship of the art to that content, then what you've read today is somehow, you've presented us 4 characters, or 5, I forget which now, and what's important about them is their relationship to a London. It's all the same London, obviously, but they're defined for the most part by their relationship to that thing which is called London. And it's, you know, when I look at photographs, say, which are purporting to be post-colonial, I'm looking for a post-colonial sensibility which is informing the work far more than I'm looking at or expecting to find, say, an image of a chip shop or a takeaway or what have you. And so I'm just thinking about, you know, when you describe these people who have who are interesting because of their relationship to this object, I wonder, sort of following along those lines, if there's something you can say about this idea of a post-colonial art,
well,
and how that might manifest.
Well, what I think is that in the Satanic Verses, it's very explicit. You know, I mean, as you rightly say, I mean, people are constantly thinking about and talking about their relationship to place and migration and history and so on and so on. I mean, it's actually it's an overt subject of the character's thoughts. And I mean, I actually think that now I probably, well, partly because once you've done something, you don't need to do it again. I mean, I think if I were to write about London now, I'd kind of be more oblique. I think, you know, in that book I came at things very directly, and I mean, that may be the reason for some of the troubles the book had, which is that it goes straight at things. You know, the trouble with going straight at things is that you hit them very hard instead of striking glancing blows, which might be more effective in the long run. You see, the trouble is, I don't think theoretically about post-colonialism. I mean, I just simply, it simply is the experience of my life, that I grew up in somewhere which had just ceased to be a colony, and then came to what even my parents would call the mother country. I mean, my parents who were involved in the independence movement. You know, nevertheless, this odd idea of England as the mother country was still there. You know, I mean, independence doesn't happen on Independence Day. And in the childhood, in the India that I grew up in, England was everywhere. And it was impossible not to be shaped by it, while at the same time being involved in all kinds of rejectionist forms of education. You know, I mean, for example, the rewriting of the history books. That was one of the things that happened, like, in the middle of my childhood. The history books that we used to be taught with when I first started being taught history were written by the English. You know, and so there were characters like, for example, Tipu Sultan, who were presented as villains, right? And then about, like, when I was 11 or something, you know, the new history books came in, and all the people who had been villains were now heroes, you know, and kind of vice versa. And as somebody who went on to study history at university, it was a very good early lesson about what history is, you know, and somebody, can't remember who said it, but history described as interviews with winners. So I mean, so what I've always understood by post-colonialism is simply the story of my life, you know, and the effect of that in writing is that one can't be unconscious of it, you know, because it was just there all the time from the beginning. Not being, but what I'm saying is that to be conscious of it all the time doesn't mean that it has to be pushed into the foreground all the time in the way that it is in the Satanic Verses. And I think that was what I was trying to do in this book. But I think having done it, I don't think it has to be done in that way, for me anyway, anymore. Because I hate the moment somebody puts a label on me, I try to run in the opposite direction. So somebody calls me magic realist, and I immediately become naturalistically obsessed. Somebody calls me a post-colonial, and I immediately want to run towards an imperialist and embrace him. so I mean, but I think even that strong rejectionist instinct has something to do with being the child of a generation that rejected an empire. But I don't think any of us who came from India, even in my generation, were fully able to reject the empire. Otherwise, what am I doing living here?
Two questions, really. First one is, I think Jibriel's condition in the book, his madness, I think it can be interestingly related to Frederick Jameson's notion of schizophrenia, which is a condition that the postmodern subject suffers, and it's very much spatial, and it relates to the subject's inability to distinguish between the inside and outside, and its inability to hold and map a totality. So if we do that, that merges the post-colonial to the postmodern, whether you agree with that. Second question is, I wonder whether you've seen a film that was made about 5 years ago by Patrick Keeler, and it's called London. And I think,
I'm afraid not. No.
I think it could provide an interesting comparison.
No, I mean, broadly speaking, I mean, I agree with your first description. I mean, I think that's broadly speaking right. I think that what happens to Jibril in the book is that his picture of the world breaks. I mean, at the moment that he is no longer able to believe in God. I mean, he calls upon God and expects God to respond, rather arrogantly, but after all, he's a movie star. And I mean, God's failure to respond disenchants him. But the trouble with that disenchantment or that loss of faith is that it unmakes the rest of him as well. He starts coming apart at the edges, And so yes, I think that's right. The kind of boundaries of the self become blurred, obscured, and that's the nature of his derangement. He doesn't understand about the real and the imagined anymore. And but it's to do with this religious crisis. And I think one of the things that's odd for me in everything that happened to the Satanic Verses is that, having written a novel in which I tried to write about a crisis of the spiritual life, to have that described as a piece of cheap abuse, is very it's very disconcerting. I guess it must be what it would be like to have been Nabokov and be accused of pedophilia, and I used to worry about it a lot, but then it occurred to me, as the Nabokov example shows, that people who abuse books usually don't read them. That actually, I doubt very much that when Joyce was being accused of blasphemy and so on, that anybody had read Dubliners or Portrait of the Artist or Ulysses. And I then began to think, well, if it's a kind of precondition of the persecution of books that they should not be read, then I suddenly felt in very good company. But anyway, that's not quite the question you asked. But yes.
Can you wait for the mic? The headphones coming towards you.
This is it's quite a difficult question for me to ask, and it was something I spoke about with some friends of mine last night when I knew that I was going to be in the same room as you, and it's something that's been in my mind for quite a while now. I'm coming from from the Muslim community in Manchester, and I mean, I think maybe I should just add, I fully support your right to write what you must write and publish. There's no dispute there, but with hindsight now, do you think you've in any way compounded the alienation of young Muslim people in this country, regardless of the rights and wrongs of that? Do you think that there is a lot of alienation within the Muslim community, and there's a tendency for young people to identify almost immediately as you identify with a football team, to identify with your religion, regardless of thinking through the consequences? And you know, I condemn fundamentalism, and I will fight that cause. But do you think you have in any way compounded the alienation of an immigrant community in this country by being seen to side with something that is anti a culture rather than a religious issue? It's a confused question, I apologise for that. I'd like your thoughts.
I'm familiar with the question. I mean, I think truthful answer is I don't know. You know, I mean, it's an event as complicated as what happened has all kinds of unlooked for effects. You know, that people can take offence without people seeking to give offence. You know, I mean, we live in a culture of offence, it seems to me. People are very quick to take offence, much quicker perhaps than I'd anticipated. In my view, it doesn't matter to offend people. I think one of the things that art does is offend people. It's always done it, probably always will do it if it's any good. That's not the point. The point is, what's it trying to do? And now you rightly say that people identify with religion as a kind of, well, or use it as a form of identity. If the Satanic Verses is about anything, it's about questioning that decision. You know, it's about saying that it's about asking whether that's the right place to root an identity or not. Now, of course, if you ask such questions, and of course, if you make, let's say, a secularist, non-believing reinterpretation, I mean, I think fairly historicist, you know, it's quite historically accurate, the Islam stuff in the Satanic Verses. Much of it based, in fact, on the hadith of the Prophet, you know, to a much greater degree than the critics of the book have ever been willing to concede. But yes, of course, it disagrees with the fundamental principle of the religion. You know? Now, there are people not going to like it. To which I can only say, I know there are people who are not going to like it. You know, but that's not why it's done. It's not done so that people are not going to like it. It's done in order to say, let's just look at this another way. You know, let's say these stories, let's say the Quranic stories, or not so much the Quranic story, but the story of the life of the Prophet, which is not, if you like, Quranic in the way that the story of the life of Christ is biblical, because the life of the Prophet isn't in the Quran. But that story, it seemed to me, was very valuable to look at as a historian, or to look at. That's what I'd done as a student. I'd studied that historically, and it seemed to me that, oddly, I thought what I was doing was exactly the opposite of what people said it was. But that's to say, I think it was quite respectful to try and look at the reality of this thing. You know, the only great world religion that was created in recorded history. It's the only one. We actually know about the birth of this religion in a way that we cannot know about the birth of Christianity or Judaism, etc. You know, because what we have, well, those religions are effectively legends rather than facts. In the case of Islam, you actually know a great deal about the circumstances, both social and personal, inside which that religion came to exist. Now, unfortunately, inside the Muslim world, there's a desire to dehistoricize it. And the reason for that is if you believe that the Quran is the uncreated word of God, then the social and personal circumstances of the Prophet are irrelevant to how that book took the shape it took, because it's got nothing to do with him. You know, it's just God. If, however, you take a historical view, which is that the reason the Quran takes the shape it takes is because of the socio-economic and cultural conditions in Arabia at that time, and because of certain very important personal aspects of the life of the Prophet, such as his being an orphan, for example, then you begin to be able to interpret it like any other sacred text. And it seemed to me that was at least a legitimate thing to try. You know. Now, whether the storm around the book created problems inside the community, I mean, yes, probably it did. You know, I mean, it probably did. But to lay that at my door is something which is at least questionable, because it seems to me I wasn't trying to kill anyone. I wasn't trying to ban any books. I wasn't trying to burn things in the town square. I wasn't throwing stones through windows. I wasn't making obscene phone calls to secretaries working at publishing companies. You know, I wasn't threatening people. So it seems to me that that process, the campaign against the satanic verses, has at least as much responsibility to bear for what happened to the Muslim community as anything inside the book itself. If you read this book, you won't find anything inflammatory in it apart from at the intellectual level. You know, at the ordinary life level, you will find, I hope, an extremely sympathetic portrait of exactly the people who burned the book. And that seems to me to be one of the saddest things about the whole story, you know, is that running through the middle of this novel, there's a kind of version of Brick Lane. And sadly, that's where the book was most disliked. I mean, that's a sadness for me. It's a loss for me. You know, it's a defeat. It means that the people I hoped who would like the book, in many ways, in many cases, were, you know, didn't go towards it. In other cases, when they found it, they were already so predisposed to feel hostile towards it that they weren't able to give it a proper reading, you know. And in some cases they found it and liked it, you know. And I've had people come up to me who were involved in the campaign against the satanic verses to say that since that time they've read the book and, you know, and now feel differently. So there we are. I mean, I hope that's some of the answer. You know.
One there, and then one back there. Yeah.
When speaking of the book, when I was deciding someone did the work of books in the 20th century, I believe the book cited Joseph Ulysses, Cosmic Memoirs, and Andre Bailey.
Petersburg.
Could you please talk about authors and cities in whom you place a great amount of importance, but also, would you please project forward a bit, because some cities are metamorphosing so rapidly, such as Mexico City, obviously places of war like Sarajevo, but also new cities in China. Could you speak about those that have been important to you in the past, but also perhaps project forward to how representations of those changing cities might
Well, a
start to
very
occur?
big question, and I think I tried to read, I did read Bialy's Petersburg because of Nabokov's recommendation, and while I kind of liked it, I didn't agree with him, I think. You know, I thought it was, I don't know, maybe it's a translation, but it didn't do it for me. Joyce, Proust, Kafka would, I think, be most of our starting points for the 20th century's literature. I mean, Joyce clearly is the artist of a city. Proust less so, although obviously, you know, the city is there as a kind of constant backdrop, but it all seems to be the same ballroom and grand hotel. So, and Kafka's city, I think, probably is the one which speaks most directly to the way in which we think about 20th century. You know, that's I mean, they're not cities, are they? But I mean, the trial is a city, the castle is a village, but somehow that sensibility of unexplained terror and, you know, unreached goals, so on, is I mean, Kafka is, in that sense, I think, the one who got the 20th century more right, you know, than anyone else, and he did it almost at the very, very beginning of the century. So that's the prophet you need, unfortunately, and he's no longer available. I think that if you're asking for what fictional representations of the city for me that have been most important, I think they've mostly been in recent fiction to do with New York. I mean, I do think that the literature of post-war New York, first the generation of the kind of the great Jewish writers, you know, Mailer and Roth and Malamud and so on. I think that put the city into the kind of center of our consciousness, you know, to a great extent. And then along came very strange representations of the city like Thomas Pynchon's. And I mean, Gravity's Rainbow, after all, is also essentially a novel about London. And I think one of the great unread novels about London, largely because it is very, very hard to read. But I think, nevertheless, an extraordinary novel about London. And I've always been a great Pynchon fan, I think one of my great sources of pride is that I am probably the only person in this room who's met Thomas Pynchon. I think at the period when I was obliged to not be in public very much, it probably appealed to Thomas Pynchon. And so we did have dinner together, and he turned out to be exactly like Thomas Pynchon. Which I mean that's, you know, writers aren't always like their books, but he was everything that I'd have expected Thomas Pynchon to be, including having a rather wonderful shock of Albert Einstein white hair and Bugs Bunny front teeth. Very tall and very shy to begin with, and then very chatty, and 4 o'clock in the morning saying, "I suppose you want to go to bed, huh?" And I was thinking, no, it's Thomas Pynchon. Stay awake. Well, so I think that's, and more recently, I think one of the most remarkable representations of the city is Don DeLillo's novel Underworld, which I think derives from all of that. You know, it's certainly impossible to read DeLillo without seeing the echoes of Pynchon there, but he's different. I mean, his prose is very different to Pynchon. Pynchon's more classical and more like, if you like, that kind of Mailer Roth kind of American writing. But I've responded very strongly to American urban fiction, you know, of the post-war period. And as far as the future, I mean, goodness knows. I mean, I think the best representation of the future city that I can think of is Blade Runner. And I don't mean the novel. You know, I mean, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is a more or less trivial novel. I mean, it's a good science fiction novel, but what it doesn't have is that incredible vision of the dystopia of the future that is just the look of Blade Runner, which every single science fiction film made since then has tried to imitate and done less well. I mean, I hope that the future doesn't turn into Blade Runner. You know? I mean, there's an interesting, I saw something about Stanley Kubrick was quoted as saying the other day, just in these moments since he died, that his great quarrel with Blade Runner is that if the replicants look so much and behave so much like human beings, what's the need for persecuting them? You know, I mean, why can't you just leave them alone? You know, didn't convince him that creatures, robotic creatures who had so many of the characteristics and kind of fluencies of human beings would in fact be persecuted because they weren't different enough. And I mean, he had been planning his own android movie that, you know, is one of the many Kubrick movies that never got made. But I think his view was that androids would have to be more different in order to be persecuted. They'd have to be, as it were, black. You know? I think that's a fair point. But I think beyond, I mean, one of the things I think about futurology is that it's wrong. You know, that, I mean, every prediction one can possibly make about the future is not what the future is going to be. If you now look at visions of the future made in the middle part of the century, I mean, you know, 1984 is 15 years ago, you know, and the world of 1984 didn't happen. I mean, this is not quite, in spite of Mr. Blair's best efforts, Airstrip 1. You know? And the Ministry of Truth is still called the BBC. Which I mean, I don't say as an insult, but only that George Orwell based the Ministry of Truth on Broadcasting House very closely. But, you know, so anything we can say will be wrong. That's the only thing we can say for certain. In that sense, it has a great deal of similarity with religion.
One last question from...
Satanic Verses seems to be in a great part about celebrity. Both Jabril and Saladin are appropriated in their angelic and demonic forms as rallying points for ethnic youth. But there's in this sense sort of a sense of one standing in for many of a reduction. But they're also redemptive figures because they provide, whether adopted or not, a source of identification. My question to you is, as ethnic divisions sort of break down on the street level now, does the status or the stakes of celebrity change, especially in these communities, and especially in the light of Stephen Lawrence, who sort of begs for a redefinition of fame, and also in light of your own status in your own recent situation as a celebrity?
Well, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if celebrity is quite the right word, but I certainly think the breakdown of those cultural barriers is more or less unadulteratedly a good thing. Unadulteratedly, wrong word. Adulteratedly, the wrong thing. As to its impact on fame, I mean, I don't know. I mean, the question at the back was makes me think that I think one of the things that happened with the Satanic Verses furore was that some people arose as kind of temporary celebrities. You know, it seemed at that point all kinds of people speaking, claiming to be representatives, claiming to be speaking for others, when often, I mean, well, they may or may not have been. Their constituencies were quite murky in some cases, but suddenly became, you know, had gained a kind of access to the media as a result of this, and in most cases they've fallen back into well-deserved obscurity, but not all. I've always been particularly an endearing memory of a gentleman called Sher Azam, who was for a time the head of the Bradford Council of Mosques, and I remember him being interviewed on Channel 4 by Jon Snow, who attempted to ask him whether he knew anything about me at all while he was busily abusing me, and pointed out that after all I had been around for a while and I'd written a number of books and etc., etc., and was he aware of any of them? And in fact, had he in fact read anything I'd ever written? Not even novels, because in fact, as he pointed out, I'd written all kinds of things about the Asian community in this country and about racism, and so on and so on. And was he aware of any of it? To which Sher Azam gave an absolutely immortal answer. He said, "No," he said. That's not the immortal part. He said, "Books are not my thing." I thought, there it is in a nutshell. You know? There are people for whom books are their thing, and there are people for whom books are not their thing, and category B is the problem. But I mean, I don't know. The problem with celebrity is that we all talk about it all the time now. I mean, it's become so much the subject. I mean, I saw a documentary on television recently at which sort of A-level kids were being asked about what they wanted to do when they grew up, and almost to one boy or girl they said, "Be famous." They said they wanted to be famous. The cause of the fame, the reason for the fame, was completely secondary. That wasn't the career. The career was being famous, and that's one of the strangest distortions of you know, Colin was mentioning about my interest in the kind of tight media loop that we live in, you know, and well, we're stuck with it. I mean, all we can do is become more and more conscious of it, and I think maybe that will in some way erode its power, because the celebrity loop seems to get tighter and tighter, the kind of creation-destruction cycle, you know, of celebrities, and survival in that atmosphere seems to be harder and harder. You know, rock groups break up before they release their first single, you know, now. Soon they'll break up before they're launched, you know, then they'll break up before they get together. And that thing, you know, celebrity eats itself, but it seems to be eating itself faster and faster. And that may be the hope for the future, may eat itself entirely, you know, and set us free. I think there's just, as a writer, there's been a really extraordinary change just in the time I've been publishing books. You know, when I first started publishing books, and, you know, I mean, I suppose Midnight's Children did well, and so suddenly I was of interest to the newspapers, and the questions that one would be asked, and certainly, you know, it's less than 20 years ago, would be entirely about the work, entirely. I mean, the number of personal questions that one was asked were something like zero. You know, nobody was, in fact, let's say the newspaper's assumption was that this person has done this thing, which has been successful, and what the readers will be interested in is how did he do it. Right? So, and what does he think about what he did? That was the general assumption. Now, I think it's true to say that one can usually get through a big interview for a new novel with a major English newspaper and be asked no questions about the book. That's entirely possible. You're asked about almost everything else. Your weight, and your ex-wives, and your clothes, and who, John le Carré. And other redundant subjects. But why you actually wrote the book you wrote, that's the thing that nobody's interested in. And that's a real shift away from the serious towards the frivolous, and I think that's it's a real problem for the culture, I think, because if that's what we think about writers, that what's important to them is where they get their shirts and who they quarrel with, then, well, it's going to have an effect on the kind of books that people get at the end. There is a kind of decay. And, well, I guess every generation thinks that they're the last generation that's safe from this decay, but I do think it's getting worse. So, I mean, in answer to the previous question about projecting into the future, I will predict that it'll get worse, which may mean that it'll get better.
Okay, well, I would like to thank Salman very much both for a wonderful reading and for